The Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
United Kingdom Internal Market Bill Committee.
Now.
We now move to Committee of the Whole House. Order. Order. Before I ask the Clerk to read the title of the bill, I should explain that in these exceptional circumstances, although the Chair of the Committee would normally sit in the Clerk's chair during committee stage, in order to comply with social distancing requirements, I will remain in the Speaker's chair, although I will be carrying out the role not of Deputy Speaker, but of Chairman of the Committee. We should be addressed as chairs of the committee rather than as deputy speakers. Clerk.
United Kingdom Internal Market Bill.
We begin with Amendment 28 to Clause 28, with which it will be convenient to consider the amendments, clauses and new clause listed on the selection paper. I call Drew Hendry to move Amendment 28.
Thank you, Dame Rosie, and of course it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I rise, as has been mentioned, to talk to Amendments 28, 29 and 30 in my name and that of my friends. When the Institute for Government warned it is not clear how disputes around the functioning of the internal market will be handled, they opened up the yawning and damning gap in the plans around the governance of the internal market. As a result of ditching cooperation over common frameworks, this government proposed to fill the gap with an Office of the Internal Market, an unelected quango. I'll return to the composition of that body shortly. The Office for the Internal Market will have an effective veto over the Scottish Parliament, and the subsequent result is that devolution will be hamstrung. This is yet another step in introducing a system where standards are set by Westminster and they must be accepted by Scotland in devolved areas. Analysis by the Scottish Government has revealed that successful Scottish policies, such as alcohol minimum unit pricing, our policy on tuition fees, and the ban on smoking in public places would be amongst the bills referred to the Office of the Internal Market. And this has been opposed by many bodies who've shone a light on this. The National Farmers Union of Scotland have raised a series of concerns over the function of the Office of the Internal Market's dispute resolution mechanism in managing policy differences, ensuring that the UK Government does not have the final say on areas of devolved policy, including agriculture, and enabling the devolved administrations to act where it is considered that a policy aligning in a particular manner is unfavourable to devolved interests such as agriculture. Of course, they wouldn't have to worry about this if the UK Government had simply continued work on common frameworks. Common frameworks are designed to manage the cross-UK divergence where EU law and devolved competencies intersect, including in relation to the functioning of the UK domestic market. Together with existing processes for regulatory impact assessment and existing structures for regulatory cooperation and information sharing, let's be clear, they do not need to be supplemented or undermined by a new unelected body.
Will he give way?
I will give way.
I thank the honourable friend for giving way. And doesn't this get to the crunch? Because they keep saying, oh, what are the powers that are being taken away from the Scottish Parliament? Well, he's outlining it. The powers that's being taken away is the power to make all of these decisions. They're going to be trumped by an unelected, unrepresentative body. And instead of having the agreements between the devolved government and the UK government, which is the framework basis that should be being implemented.
I couldn't agree more, and it simply doesn't have to happen. Scotland doesn't need it, and Scotland doesn't want it. this bill undermines, well, you know, from a sedentary position, he says, so I say, yes, I am saying that. But that's also what the National Farmers Union are saying. It's also what the Institute of Government have pointed out. It's also what a number of other bodies have pointed out, that this is just not necessary. In fact, we have something here that we could work with cooperation, which I'll come on to in a moment. But of course, the UK government don't want cooperation and consultation and working together. What they want is just to impose their will, and that's what they're trying to do again. This bill undermines not just the basic foundations of devolution, but goes further, hitting all existing mechanisms for cooperation and the development of common frameworks. It's not this abomination that's required, it's the establishment of those common frameworks, mutually agreed, developed and implemented through consent with effective governance and processes for regulatory impact. But the UK, that will give way.
Thank you, the honourable member, for allowing me to give way. He called the Office for the Internal Market an unelected quango. Does he accept if he had his way, he would be handing powers back to unelected quangos in Brussels?
Well, no, you see, this is the argument that they try to propagate all the time, that somehow by these powers coming to Scotland, they would immediately be transferred to unelected people in the EU. Two things are wrong with that. First of all, nobody in the EU is actually unelected when they make decisions on these. They are all elected by either the Parliament or the people they go there. Yeah. But the second and most fundamental point with that is that under these proposals, the UK government is simply taking all control and overriding all of the ability for the Scottish Parliament and the votes and the people who voted for the representatives in the Scottish Government to do the Scottish Parliament, for them to do their jobs in terms of representing them on the choices that they want to see. The UK government say, I'll make some progress. The UK government say they want to, and I quote, guarantee the continued right of all UK companies to trade unhindered in every part of the UK. Under this proposal, businesses simply have to have deep enough pockets to challenge the democratic decisions of the Scottish Parliament and the members elected by the people of Scotland to represent and make decisions for them. For some, it'll be the sale of the century, or bargain hunt as they go looking for these things. For those who want to set their sights on Scottish domestic choices, it doesn't stretch the imagination much to picture private health companies operating in England or private water companies operating in England to look at our publicly owned organisations and seek to challenge that they have, under the UK government's auspices, a guaranteed right to trade in Scotland. That's the first big flashing red light here. I will give it.
The points that he's making, and is he as concerned as I am to find that when there's a dispute that the CMA has to then arbitrate on, that the CMA doesn't have to publish the report of that finding on the basis that the commercial information, the disclosure of which the CMA thinks might significantly harm the legitimate business interests of any person. So they could well cover up the results of any dispute report in favour of private business.
Exactly, some honourable friend makes a telling point. To say that the protections are opaque would be an exaggeration. They're nowhere near as good as that. I will give way.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable John giving way. I'm keen, as I mentioned yesterday, to learn more about some of the points of view that he is expressing. In the alternative of having the Common Frameworks Agreement, if it is the case that you couldn't get reconciliation between the constituent nations of the country on what the regulation should be, what would be the implications for business as a result of that?
The problem with that question is that there is also already, as I mentioned at the start of my opening remarks, there is already a process for dealing with that, the common frameworks. What I'm absolutely saying is the UK government does not have to take this hammer and smash devolution in order to get these things organised so that business can cooperate and work across the different nations of the UK, taking cognizance of the choices made by those individual parliaments across the nations of the UK. I will make some progress because I want to come on to the composition of the Office of the Internal Market. Now, I would be grateful if the Minister could intervene and give some answers to these questions. Who are these people? Yeah. Who will sit down in judgment over the democratically made decisions in the Scottish Parliament? Do we know yet? Do we have any idea? These words from the Prime Minister are coming back on him, as so many of his outpourings do. He said, talking about the EU, of course, they may decide that now is the time, even though electorates are already feeling alienated from the political process, to hand sensitive decisions to unelected bureaucrats. But it's what he's decided. He's decided to hand these decisions to unelected bureaucrats. What grace and favour appointments will we see to this body? Will any of them have links to any of the many vested interests that find it apparently so easy to pick up contracts from this government? The fact of this is something we can only guess at. But the point underlines how dangerous this is for Scottish people and communities. So we reject this body of unelected, unknown bureaucrats having power over the Scottish Parliament, having power over the Scottish people. We've tabled Amendments 28, 29 and 30, as I said, in my name and that of my friends. The amendment would exempt from the operation of Part 4 independent advice and monitoring on UK market regulatory provisions applying in Scotland which did not apply to the whole of the UK. The SNP wants Scotland removed from Part 4 of the bill via this amendment as undermines devolution. Decisions made by our elected representatives must be upheld. Dame Rosie, it is a democratic outrage that this is being proposed to overrule the Scottish Parliament. Let's be clear, we cannot and we will not accept this legislation in any form. Under the unelected Dominic Cummings, this Prime Minister is forcing this power grab through, despite overwhelming opposition from Scottish Parliament, from Scotland's Parliament and MPs. It proves that Scotland will never, ever be accepted as an equal partner in the UK. This attacks the foundations of devolution and gives Westminster an unelected quango a free hand to overrule the Scottish Parliament in devolved areas, threatening our NHS, our food and environmental standards, and fires the starting pistol on a race to the bottom. Under this, I will give way.
I fully agree with this very well drafted Amendment 28, and the same should apply, of course, to Wales and Northern Ireland, because it would ensure and allay any fears in the respective devolved countries in the UK that the British government aren't using this internal market bill to torpedo devolution.
Indeed, and this is a matter that doesn't just affect Scotland, as he said, and even the Labour-run Welsh Government have come out to stand against these measures. I will give way, yes, happy to.
He's made some strong points, but would he agree with me that it doesn't have to be this way? He'll know that our Counsel General, Jeremy Miles, has been giving evidence alongside one of the Scottish ministers this morning to a committee in this place. And he spoke of the actual engagement and discussion they had with the previous Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, and how that completely dried up at the start of this year. So much so that they didn't even get the details of this bill until the night before it was published.
And that sort of attitude towards what should be a cooperation over our common interest underlines the contempt that's being shown for the devolved nations. And, it's just yet another example. So, as I've said, we cannot and we will not accept this legislation in any form. All this bill does is to simply and plainly underline why the democratic choices that represent Scottish people, along with the protection of our Parliament, can only be delivered and can only be protected with the powers of independence for Scotland to take its place as an independent nation amongst the other independent nations of the world.
The question is that Amendment 28 be made. Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The arguments that I've just heard from the honourable member are, in my judgment, completely unjustified. The arrangements, as you might expect, it's hardly surprising, but the reality is that what is intended in this bill is to provide for independent advice and monitoring through the creation of this internal market itself within the Competition and Markets Authority arrangements. Now, what that clearly says, and far from it being just a bunch of nodding donkeys, which is more or less what the honourable gentleman is saying, in fact, it will be a non-ministerial department, albeit sponsored by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and it will have an enormous amount and range of experience and knowledge which is brought from its predecessor. Yes.
Gentleman for giving way, especially as I just recently concluded my remarks. But can he confirm for me two things? Who will be on this body and who has, and he will know the answer to this, who has the final say over this body?
Is that it's not going to be the European Union. And that, if I may say, summarises the argument in a nutshell.
For giving way, if we come to the here and now and we're looking at this bill, say in the future the Scottish Government wants to support the Scottish farming industry, the UK Government's decided that as free marketeers they're pulling all support for their farmers. Under these proposals, isn't it the case then that Scottish state aid for their farmers would be ruled illegal and they wouldn't be able to trade in the UK internal market?
The provisions of the bill as a whole maintain the union, which is absolutely essential to the future of our competitiveness internationally.
For giving way. I'm a unionist too. I believe in our union. I believe we're stronger together. But the reality is that this approach taken by this government with this bill disrespects the devolution settlement, and it rides roughshod over the wishes of the Welsh Government, which, let's not forget, is run by a party, Welsh Labour, which is a unionist party, but one that believes in devolution. So why does he think that the Welsh Government, that wants to cooperate with this government in finding common frameworks, is so unhappy with the approach taken in this bill?
Very happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
Very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. If I could just take him back to his comments a moment ago when he was lecturing myself and my colleagues about how important it is to be part of the same political union in order to trade freely and competitively. If that applies to Scotland in relation to the United Kingdom, why doesn't it apply to the United Kingdom in relation to the European Union? Can he explain that to me? I'm very grateful because I'm going to answer his question. The SNP wants Scotland to remain part of the European Union, a single market of over 500 million consumers. The SNP do not wish to put up trade barriers with England. It is his party that wish to enforce upon us trade barriers if we dare to exercise our democratic right of self-determination, which he spent the last 40 years banging on about in this House for England.
I may say not unsuccessfully, if I may say so far. But it seems to me that the whole of this arrangement makes enormous sense in the post-Brexit world, where we will no longer be subjected to the what I regard as predatory arrangements, which are built into the undemocratic way in which those who have the ear of the internal part of the European Commission get their way so often that we are discriminated against, and we will have our own system on our own terms in accordance with the decisions that were taken by the British people in the general election this last December, which endorsed the decision that was made in the referendum.
3 withdrawn, so we go straight to Richard Fuller.
Well, thank you very much, Dame Rose. It was unexpected, but it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to have the opportunity to raise some general points and then some specific questions as it relates to the clauses under consideration today. I guess overall, of course, I'm very supportive of the bill, but I would urge the government that, as with any substantial change, caution and checking and prudence should be a part of the process that the government undertakes. For myself, when I look at regulations and regulatory frameworks, which perhaps I do a little too often, the things that are uppermost in my mind is the quality of the regulations that we anticipate, or the framework, the effectiveness of the regulations, the relevance of the regulations, and whether we have the correct allocation of decision authorities over the regulations upon which those different parts of the United Kingdom or different groups are being made. And if I could start with that last one, and I was really just picking up on some of the issues that have animated the opposition spokesman today, and perhaps others in their questions, is about this choice of an approach compared with the common framework. And this is an area which perhaps I should know more about than I do, but it is alluded to in the explanatory notes that came with the bill in Part 8. And if I could, with your leave, Madam Chair, just quote this. It says in Part 8, as part of its vision for the UK internal market, the government is also engaging in a process to agree a common approach to regulatory alignment with the devolved administrations. The Common Frameworks Programme aims to protect the UK internal market by providing high levels of regulatory coherence in specific policy areas through close collaboration with the devolved administrations. So that's in the explanatory notes. And so my question to the Minister is, where is that in the bill or in the considerations that we have today? What is the current thinking of how the government, as it says in the explanatory notes, part of its vision, engaging a process to a common approach? I didn't get an answer from the Honourable Member for Inverness to my question about how disputes would be resolved in a common framework approach. That seems to me to be a fundamentally important issue because, and I'm happy to take an intervention if you'd like to, and then I'll go on if he wants to intervene.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way so I can respond to what was obviously my deficit in not answering his question fully. I'm happy to try and do so now. The fact of the matter is that the Joint Ministerial Council was working on a programme where, and with some success I understand with ministers on both sides, before this bill was introduced, where all of these types of issues could be ironed out and could be done in a collaborative and consultative way with each of the governments of the devolved nations. But that's been thrown asunder. And I look forward to the answer to the question about how this collaboration is going to work in future, when this bill simply overlays that with an unelected quango and the ability for the Secretary of State for Bays to make the ultimate decisions and this Parliament.
Yes.
Honourable Gentleman for giving way, but I think he's highlighting the fundamental weakness of the bill from our perspective, because the internal market is a shared asset between the four countries of the UK, but what's missing from the bill is clear intergovernmental structures to govern it.
Don Ryan's absolutely right. So I would, if I'd like to then slightly now move on, Madam Chair, to some of the specific clauses, because some of the detail about this, where we give powers to regulate. My general point, Madam Chairman, is that we're very keen as politicians to do the new thing, set new regulations, but we spend very little time checking on whether those regulations worked, or whether the regulatory body is doing any good, or indeed whether the regulatory body is doing what it said it was going to do in the first place. And so I think it is important for us just to get a little more precision from the government on some of the words that it uses in its bill, and particularly, if I may draw the attention of the House to Clause 29 and Paragraph 5. And the Minister may be able to help. This talks about the reports that the CMA must prepare a report on. And it says in Part 5b, developments as to the effectiveness of the operation of that market. Now, the word effectiveness can have lots of different meanings to lots of different people. What is the remit that we are giving to this Office of the Internal Market about how it will judge the definition of an effective operation of the market? Does that, for example, include the fact that the operation of the market continues to have the consent of all of the constituent devolved administrations of the United Kingdom? Does it involve the issue that the effectiveness means that the country has an adequate spread of production across the country? Does it mean that each market is promoting competition? Does it mean that prices are going down? The word effectiveness has a lot of issues. Chair, also goes to Clause 29, if I can find it, subsection 8. So far as report on this section is concerned with the effective operation of the internal market in the UK, the report may consider, among other things, competition, access to goods and services, volumes of trade. Well, I would say that's a partial list. There may be other aspects that we would wish this Office of the Internal Market to look into when it considers the operation of the internal markets on which I have mentioned. So, for example, is the Minister considering, or would he consider, that this should include the impact of the internal market on consumer rights? Should it include regional disparities? And most importantly, should it include innovation and competition? If I may move on to clause 33A, slowly. This is the condition where we're talking about the advising on proposed regulatory provisions on request. And this is an important issue about the points that my honourable friend, the member for Inverness, was raising in his speech, which is not only the decisional authorities, but the scope for devolved administrations to raise issues with the Office of the Internal Market. And in clause 33A, it is a condition, these are the conditions that a requesting authority can be made. It combines clause A, the regulatory provision to which the proposal relates would fall within the scope of this part and be within relevant legislative competence, and the proposal should be further considered in the light of the significance of its potential effects on the operation of the internal market in the United Kingdom. It would seem to me, Madam Chair, particularly in light of the desire for devolved administrations to have some potential to do innovations in regulation, such as minimum alcohol pricing, that and might be better considered as an or, that it would be feasible for devolved administrations to raise issues which may be outside of the scope of their current remit of responsibilities, but for which the devolved administrations, elected by their local representatives, their local voters, wish to see as a potential regulatory change in the future. And what is the harm that could be caused by enabling that to be considered by the Office of the Internal Market? 35. There's an amendment by the Honourable Member, the member for North East Fife. And the Honourable Member for North East Fife is talking about the participation in these committee on the authority. And prior to, obviously the Honourable Lady may wish to speak to her amendment directly, but I would just draw the Minister's attention to this about the participation in the CMA. I think it is a relevant fact about sort of who is going to be on these bodies. I think it is a relevant fact. We put the great and the good on off of these, it's my pleasure. We put the great and the good, or the so-called great and the good, on these regulators. We don't really know who they are. What's the oversight that we have about their performance? What's the oversight and decision rights that we have on appointments? And wouldn't it be a consideration that that should be spread beyond this Parliament to include devolved administration? So I would urge my honourable friend, the Minister, to look carefully at the amendment proposed by the Honourable Lady the Member for North East 5 and her news clause 4.
Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I consider part 4 of the bill, I just want to briefly set the context of the comments that I will make. So yesterday, Scotland's friends in the EU and the wider international community were concerned that a UK Prime Minister was prepared to sacrifice the rule of law in a vain attempt to save his own bacon. Of course, as the disbelief that this arrogance is only voiced outside of the Cummings bubble, we know that the deliberate trashing of the UK's international standing is now endorsed by 340 parliamentarians, and so can no longer be regarded as the ravings of a few. They are all now complicit in this grand folly of legislation. It's a disgraceful piece of legislation led by a Prime Minister whose words mean nothing, and a party that is lurching ever further to the right, breaking the rules, acting unlawfully, and now rewriting its own laws while rubbishing any moral authority the UK had to hold rope. And having presided over a summer of U-turns, and U-turning on his own Brexit deal, and turning away from the rule of law, the comments in terms of Scotland can be summed up thus. In the Law Society of Scotland's reflections on this bill, they have stated as a matter of principle, the bill should comply with the oldest principle of international law, pacta sunt servanda. Agreements are to be kept. Well, Scotland, quite unfortunately, has a head start in knowing the hollowness of such a principle. The this session is focusing on Part 4 of the bill, and in this bill, the authority of the CMA and the wide-ranging and poorly specified powers of the UK government's man in Scotland is nothing short of a British nationalist inquisition. Wide-ranging powers that cut to the very heart of the devolution settlement across every policy area, powers they claim they will never use. They're just there in case. Well, Scotland isn't buying it, and we're not having any of it. Devolution is the settled and robustly expressed will of the Scottish people, and it must be for the Scottish people alone to decide if this should ever be restricted or changed in any way. Madam Chair, Part 4 of the Wrecking Ball Bill takes decision-making powers away from Holyrood and hands them to an unelected body of the Office of the Internal Market. This Office of Inquisition will have the power to pass judgment on devolved laws, could quickly become the target of rich corporate lobbyists determined to see activities such as fracking go ahead against the will of the Scottish people. Yes, I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And isn't the power grab just compounded by the fact that the government clearly intends to push this legislation through without the legislative consent to this bill from any of the devolved administrations? So when they ask, where is the power grab? Give us an example of the power grab. That's it. They're refusing even to accept the fact that the devolved legislatures won't consent to the bill and they won't engage on the detail of it. So the power grab runs right the way through this process.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his contribution. If I could just answer the honourable gentleman before I progress. He is absolutely right, and the notion that there is a power surge of any shape or form, I will come on to address shortly. I will give it.
Apologies. Thank you very much indeed for letting me take a moment. I'm sorry, I was a bit keen. But the Internal Markets Bill, would you agree with me, though, that without the Internal Markets Bill itself, without the internal market structure, Scotland would be worse off? Because, forgive me, but if I may explain my point, and I won't talk about whisky, because we always talk about whisky when we're talking about Scotland. I'll talk about lenses for glasses, for example. They're often made in Scotland. There's a large number of those made in Scotland that go across the whole of the UK. If we didn't have the internal market structure, then there could be tariffs, there could be restrictions on those being sold in, say, Wales or England. So why is it you wouldn't want to accept this now?
Honourable Lady raises a really interesting point, and it's something that I wanted to get into the remarks I'm making today, but actually she's given me a very clear avenue of which to do it now. I can't understand how she would come up with the suggestion that the UK would enforce its own internal tariffs. But in regards to Scottish competitiveness in this internal market, it is already at a disadvantage. There is a company in my constituency in Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath who imports chassis from the EU. Now, they don't make their lorries completely here, and like many of their EU competitors, they buy certain parts and basically put them together. But EU companies would be allowed to import a fully completed vehicle without any tariff, whilst they would be subject to a high tariff for the importation of those chassis, and therefore would be at a competitive disadvantage because of Brexit. Because of Brexit.
Yeah, well said.
So I'm grateful, and I would be very grateful if the Minister would take cognizance of the comments that I've just made and give me a detailed response about how they are going to protect companies such as that in my constituencies from this type of disadvantage from importation of completed vehicles.
Okay. The internal market doesn't just guarantee costs and prices of things, it also guarantees standards. So one of my favourite Scottish to England exports, if you like, is Brewdog's own Punk IPA. how can the honourable member, without the internal market, guarantee that my pint of Punk IPA in Peterborough is of the same quality as it is in Aberdeen?
Neil Henry.
Thank you to the honourable member for raising yet another very helpful point. The problem is not that the quality of Punk IPA will be consistently high in the north and the south, or even in Europe if they are still able to import it. The problem is that the quality at the lowest level will have to be accepted everywhere. It's not the highest level that's the issue, it's the lowest level. I will try to make progress. I hope it's beginning to make sense now, Madam Chair, why I had that preamble. Anyway, as I said, devolution is the settled will and robustly expressed will of the Scottish people, and it's for them alone to decide if this should ever be restricted or changed in any way. If this law had been enforced during the last 20 years of devolution, Scotland's ability to prioritise important issues like free tuition for Scottish students, set important health policies such as minimum unit price on alcohol, introduce the smoking ban before other nations, they would all have been at risk. They may not have happened. And looking forward, things like procurement or changes to the food standards that can be imposed on Scotland as devolution is reduced to the powers of compliance, complicity or subjugation. Yep. Can you imagine the howls from the benches opposite if the EU had proposed such legislation? Yet they are content to do this to Scotland and then tell us that we should be grateful. What a charade. Well, Scotland isn't buying it and we're having none of it. This legislation strips powers away from our democratically elected representatives on decision-making in Holyrood. In an email to MSPs on the 14th of September, the Royal Society of Edinburgh have warned that while final decision-making power ultimately would remain with the UK government, the use of this authority by the CMA against the wishes of devolved administrations constitutes a failure of intergovernmental relations. The reality is that Part 4 grabs the powers of devolution and gives them to an unelected, barely accountable quango. The bill grabs the powers of devolution, animal welfare, forestry, voting rights, food standards, energy, all currently the purview of the Scottish Parliament. The government say that they are empowering Scotland. The truth is they are robbing Scotland of democracy itself. This would make Scotland's Parliament and our law meaningless and smash devolution.
Yeah, exactly.
And what of the protestations of this government's man in Scotland and his self-congratulatory terms of a power surge? What is crystal clear now is the only power surging is to the CMA, the Office of the Internal Market, and to the Secretary of State in Scotland.
Will the gentleman give way?
I will indeed give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I wonder if he would agree with me that these protestations that there is some kind of power surge are simply incompatible with the means by which it's suggested that this office for the internal market will be set up so that it can lie above the powers of the Scottish Parliament.
Here, here. I thank my honourable friend for those comments, because really it illustrates the sophistry in the way that this whole charade has been presented. We are told that it's a power surge, and a power surge it is, but it's a power surge in the wrong direction. It's a power surge away from the devolved government of Scotland.
Here, here.
The use of those powers, based on past behaviour, will be to interfere, undermine and diminish not just the elected government of Scotland, but the very voice of the Scottish people. Exactly. Yesterday I listened to members in this chamber claim that this bill strengthens the union, and in their mind that may be true. But it's not being strengthened by a shared vision, mutual respect, or by other honourable means. It is the strength of bondage, of subjugation and the pomposity that only unionist voices matter. I have news for you. It does not strengthen the bonds of the union. It exposes the bondage of devolved nations and illustrates why Scotland must choose an independent future.
Yeah.
Lead not leave. Broad shoulders of the Union. Vote no to stay in the EU. We love you, Scotland. Well, nothing epitomises a union of equals like the Prime Minister bestowing the effective status of Viceroy of Scotland on the Honourable Member for Dumfries and Galloway, his very own Union Jack. Today, the international community knows something the Scottish people have known since 2014. Believe not a word, not a promise, not even a vow. To this government, agreements are always optional. This bill does not strengthen your union, it strengthens the case for Scottish independence.
Yeah. Joy Morrissey.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. To look at the clauses, Clause 28, where Scotland wants to be left out, Clause 29, following legislative appeal for all the devolved powers to have consultation for any changes, Clause 35, prior to publishing any information that CMA must consult with all Scottish, Welsh, Northern Ireland ministers and devolved administrations. All of these clauses, Madam Chairman, seem to have one thing in common, which is asking for all consultation for how we move our internal market forward to be done with the devolved powers within the United Kingdom. Now, I would wager, we've talked, many in this House have raised the issue of who will be holding the CMA to account. Now, I would offer that we here represent the entire United Kingdom. We are elected to represent all parts of the United Kingdom. Why could not... I will give way, yes.
I thank her for giving way. So is that her confirming that Westminster should take sovereignty over the devolved administrations in the will of the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments?
I've been listening very carefully to what those across the House have been saying, across the bench, and the points that you have been raising. And I am very sympathetic to your cries about lack of democratic representation, because that is why I voted to leave the EU, for the very reason of the lack of democratic representation by the European Commission, which oversees the single market. May I? Yes, I will give way.
To the Honourable Lady for giving way. Is she aware of the Sewell Convention? And if so, what is her objection to the Amendment 29 laid in the names of my honourable friends?
Here. Thank you. For Clause 29, it says, following legislative approval from all devolved administrations. Why, and are you asking for all of the devolved administrations to be represented at the federal level, for which
I'll answer the question
is the... I will give way.
The Sewell Convention, which was put on a statutory footing before the Honourable Lady was a member of this House, but many of us who were at that time will remember it. The Sewell Convention states that this Parliament will not normally legislate in respect of devolved matters without the consent of the devolved administrations. That convention exists. It's on a statutory footing. So what is her objection to Clause 29?
When we're talking about the internal market, we are talking about the objective, not a political objective, but an economic objective for removing regulatory obstacles for more goods and services and to make ourselves globally competitive. We're removing the technical, legal, bureaucratic barriers.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. And on that point of credibility, does she think it is just possible that the reason that credibility has been lost is because of her Prime Minister disagreeing with himself, rather than for any other reason?
Beth Winter.
This Tory government leadership said during the Brexit campaign that leaving Europe would enable the British people to take back control. This bill does the opposite of that. It's driving a race to the bottom by harmonising standards in such a way that gives the UK government the power to overrule devolved nations. Experience tells us that this Conservative government has repeatedly refused to commit to higher standards in legislation. There has not been the kind of negotiation or involvement or informed consent to any of this with the devolved nations. While it is important as the UK leaves the EU for us to have a system to harmonise standards across the four countries, any internal market legislation should be looking to doing the least possible on a centralised basis and as much as possible on a decentralised basis. And anyway, in the view of the Senedd in Wales, there already exists a successful regime in the form of the common framework to form the basis for all future arrangements. This attempt to harmonise standards throughout the UK is in fact an attempt to replicate the EU's internal market, but with some crucial differences. In the EU, dispute resolution is independent and is done in such a way that it prevents the bigger members being able to force smaller states to accept undesirable standards. In the government's proposals for the UK, the opposite will be true, as the Conservatives prefer a mutual recognition principle of harmonising standards so that the lowest standards legislated for by any of the UK parliaments must automatically be adopted by all. Devolution is not just an abstract concept. It is what has allowed Welsh Government and the Scottish Government to develop more ambitious standards and policies than its Westminster counterparts, protecting the NHS as a publicly owned service, develop world-leading standards in food, animal welfare, the environment, which are now under threat with the Conservative Internal Market Bill. As an example, I'm an environmentalist and I've got a great interest in reducing the use of plastics, and I know that the Minister for European Transition, Jeremy Hunt in Wales, has spoken on the same issue only in the last couple of days. Now, the Welsh Government proposes to introduce a ban for 9 single-use plastic items, but the UK Government proposes a similar ban on just 3 of those same 9 items. Now, the principle of mutual recognition in the UK could mean that Wales will be unable to enforce the ban on the sale of the other 6 items. The Chair of the Senedd Constitution, Justice and Legislative Committee, Mick Anthony, MS in Wales, has stated, and I agree with him, it's quite clear from this bill that the aim of the Tory government is to cement the neoliberal economic and social agenda into a framework of a centralised state, and this bill shows their contempt for devolution, the Constitution and the rule of law. Mutual recognition is a blunt instrument, and it is not clear why this path is the government's preference when it renders the notion of common frameworks completely obsolete at a stroke. Now, the government's previously supported a common frameworks approach, and in fact all 4 UK governments signed up to this in 2017, though perhaps it should not come as a surprise that the government in Westminster is prepared to sign things in bad faith. Common frameworks would allow for a genuinely collaborative approach between Westminster and the devolved administrations, with standards between the nations being harmonised through discussion and negotiation between equals, and I'll stress the point equals, as opposed to new obligations being imposed on the devolved governments against their wishes under the new mutual recognition principle.
My honourable friend is making a very, very strong speech and absolutely getting to the nub of this issue. And she talks about unilateralism and why we should be concerned about that. I mean, I deeply share the concern she has about food and environmental standards. But we've seen that in recent days. She knows in her own constituency with COVID testing, unilateral decisions being taken at UK level to reduce testing in Wales, impacting on our constituents. So would she agree with me that there is an absolute reason why we are so concerned about the way that this bill is being put forward?
I would certainly agree. And thank you for your contribution. And this is why what Labour's new clause proposes. I will be voting for the clause this evening, and I do not see a valid reason for any member of the House not to do the same. It's a clause which supports the objective of this bill, the creation of a UK single market to reduce barriers to trade, while still respecting the principles of devolution, which are supported by a strong majority of Welsh people. Diolch yn fawr, Chair.
Alan Smith. Here.
Thank you, Sir Graham. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. This bill is difficult for us. It is offensive to our values, frankly. It's not our worldview, and it's being put forward in pursuit of a project that Scotland comprehensively rejected. We are, however, engaging in good faith, but we do not consent to this project. Scotland does not consent to the way this bill is drafted. But I wasn't sent by the people of Stirling to showboat and then walk away, to grandstand and not try to find solutions. We have put forward Amendments 28 and 29 in good faith to build in, and it's typical of all of our amendments, to insert into this dreadful piece of legislation the principle of consent of the Scottish Parliament and other devolved administrations. And if we can't do that, then to exempt Scotland from this matter. We are engaging in this process in good faith. We are working within the constitutional reality of the United Kingdom, and if this House proves, in rejecting these amendments, the constitutional reality of the United Kingdom in full view of the people of Scotland doesn't work for us. So, as I say, I was sent here to try and find solutions. Amendments 28 and 29 do so. We believe that decisions for Scotland should be made in Scotland.
Hear, hear.
It's a fundamental principle of devolution that, unless reserved to this place, decisions should be made by the democratically elected Parliament of Scotland. That principle was endorsed by the people of Scotland with 74% of the vote in 1997. For the members opposite who are keen on referendums, they really should be aware that they are upending a deeply held principle of the people of Scotland.
Hear, hear.
So this bill, as I have said, is a poor piece of legislation, and it didn't need to be this way. And this is where I find this so frustrating and so offensive morally, politically, even intellectually. It didn't need to be this way. We are open to negotiation. We are open to frameworks. We respect the fact that we have left the European Union. I regret it deeply. We regret it deeply, but it has happened. I accept, as a solicitor to trade myself, that there needs to be a domestic legal construct to replace the single market legislation of the European Union. But it doesn't need to be this abomination.
Hear, hear.
We could do this better. Our amendments seek to make this bad bill better. We'll still not be keen on it, we'll still not be in favour of it, but it doesn't need to be the naked power grab that it is. On the generality of Part 4, Sir Graham, Part 4 seeks to replace 60 years of jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice, the European Commission, democratically overseen by the democratically elected members of the European Parliament, and the member state governments, themselves democratically elected. 60 years of expertise on how the single market and internal competition works. Oh, please.
I'm back. Just to clarify on that point, it's actually the European Commission that oversees the single market, and it's the European Commission, which is an unelected body, which does oversee and creates the market frameworks. So I just...
I do thank the member for that point. As in my 15 years in the European Parliament, I was always struck by how many unelected bureaucrats had been democratically elected by the people that they serve. But it's great to engage with something that doesn't quite exist, but the European Commission she wishes did. And for people who are against unelected bureaucrats, I can only suggest they have a look at the reality of this bill. Yeah. What this bill does is replace the 60 years of jurisprudence overseen by the experts in the European Commission, the experts in the Court of Justice, the democratically elected MEPs, the democratically elected member state governments, by a group of people who will themselves be unelected. They will be appointed, but they've not been appointed yet. We don't know who they are.
Yep.
They'll be operating a competition policy which has not as yet been revealed by this government that's so desperately negotiating with itself it can't actually tell our European partners what it's trying to do. And these people will be operating with a budget that hasn't yet been shown to us and a jurisprudence that doesn't yet exist. It takes a heroically Panglossian approach to all of this to think that that can be created in a matter of months. This chimera, this shibboleth that's going to be created by this bill, and I've already explained the reality of how devolution works. Unless reserved to this place, decisions should be made in Scotland. This shibboleth, with people not yet appointed, operating to a policy not yet decided, to a budget that hasn't been agreed, with a jurisprudence that doesn't exist, will sit above, as a politically appointed death panel, every single decision of every single public authority in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and indeed England. Every decision involving public expenditure will be gainsaid by this unelected quango that doesn't yet exist and we don't know what it is. So from our perspective, it is replacing a system that we are comfortable with. We respect the fact we've left the European Union. We don't like it, but we have. But a system that works tolerably well is going to be replaced with a system that doesn't exist. and is politically motivated, ideologically driven, and owes nothing to the creation of jobs or safeguarding of jobs or standards, it is entirely a political project to get as much power to this place as possible against the objections of the Senedd in Wales. On that point, sir.
We'll give way. And does he suspect, as I do, that perhaps some appointed to this unelected body might be more of the chums that we've seen of the Prime Minister in the likes of Tony Abbott? You know, disgraced former Prime Minister of Australia, political appointment, totally unsuitable for the role, yet appointed to that because he shares the same political views as the Prime Minister.
So. Very grateful for the point and very strongly agree. We don't know who these people are going to be. We don't know how they're going to be appointed. And forgive me, from the track record of the government thus far, I have little faith in who they're going to be and what their agenda is actually going to be in practice.
Indeed.
So our concern is about the lack of power that the people of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and indeed England, will have over that process. And indeed this Parliament. The oversight that this Parliament will have over this process, under the very text of this bill, which is a wider discussion than these amendments, Sir Graham, is appalling. So it didn't need to be this way. And we've heard opposite from some of the members today earlier in the debate that there should be uniform standards across the UK. It's a superficially appealing point, as superficial arguments go, which seems to be what the members opposite deal in. But the single market within the European Union operates very successfully with different standards. And the whole point of devolution is that different places are empowered to make different decisions. So there may well be different standards, different practices, different expectations, different rules in different parts of the four home nations. That's the point. This bill is a mechanism, a political mechanism, to override and destroy that democratic diversity and replace it with devolution as power retained. It is a naked power grab for all to see. And I would urge people outside this House, Sir Graham, to read this bill carefully, because it makes the case for independence for Scotland all the stronger. We are comfortable. Please.
Talking about standards, the British should be very proud of their standards in animal welfare and particularly in farming. I certainly am from our Cornish farmers. And we've done that whilst we've been part of the European Union. And our standards are higher than many of our counterparts in the European Union. Having a single internal market does not mean that we will lower standards in anything. We can learn from each other and keep our higher standards in all parts of the United Kingdom.
It does. Well, in which case I do hope the Honourable Lady is going to supporting our amendment, which makes clear on the explicit face of the bill that there will be no cutting of standards, which is not under consideration today, Sir Graham, but it is there in black and white. And it was curious to see Conservative members refuse to support the previous reasoned amendment from my former MEP colleague, who put forward precisely that in a previous piece of legislation, and it was rejected.
Exactly.
Because this is a government that is so desperate not to tie its hands with such considerations as lowering standards, because that may well be what needs to be traded away in future trade deals. And if you're not, if one isn't, please.
Honourable Fred, just on that point, wasn't it just this Sunday that a UK government minister refused to rule out the fact that we would have to import and sell chlorinated chicken? A product which is produced in the filth of the animals in the cage, amongst the pests that they live in. That's why it's chlorinated.
Yeah, absolutely so. We are deeply concerned on behalf of Scotland's farmers, and indeed everybody else's, that trade deals could see a lowering of standards, that mutual recognition of the UK internal market could undermine the capacity of the different authorities to have those rules. Please.
I thank him for giving way on that. And on that concern about the lowering of standards, previously the International Trade Secretary said consumers will choose, or up to consumers to choose what products they want to shelves. Does that in itself not indicate a Trojan horse for a lowering of standards that would affect Scottish farming?
Exactly that. Fully agree with the gentleman who's been fighting for farmers in his constituency for many years. The new Clause 5, which I hope we do have some support from the opposition benches on, is specifically about the maintenance of minimum standards. So I hope when the House comes to consider that, there will be support. Because if we are scaremongering about lowering standards, it's on the amendments. Those amendments can be supported to make explicit in this bill that there will not be. Prove us wrong. By refusing to back the amendment, we will be proven right. I shall.
the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's making a very cogent speech in favour of independence, obviously, basically, because I thank him for his lectures on constitutional history and from the honourable learned member for Edinburgh South West on the Seal Convention. But those predate us getting into the internal market in the first place. And what this bill seeks to do is to restore the status quo ante in this country, that we have an internal market. It's not a power grab. The amendments are a grab for independence, and I quite understand why they're making them, but that is what is going on here. You are trying to further, he is trying to further independence through these amendments. I completely understand that, but that's why we're going to be rejecting them.
Do your job. Yeah.
I take the point, Sir Graham, that the gentleman makes, and he accuses me of promoting the case for independence, and indeed I do promote the case for independence.
Yeah.
But the members opposite really do need to be in no doubt. There is a substantial element of the population of Scotland deeply disgusted by this process.
Yeah.
Frustrated by the disrespect that Scotland has been shown. Since the EU referendum, where we rejected Brexit significantly, but were told to shut up and get back in our box. Just after the 2014 referendum, where we'd been told we were a partnership of equals. But we were then told, immediately afterwards, we are part of the United Kingdom, not a partner in it. This bill makes that explicit in the eyes of the people of Scotland. And I won Stirling from the party opposite with 51% of the vote, precisely because I am actually in favour of the rule of law. I am actually in favour of international solidarity, as demonstrated by the multilateral binding voluntary solidarity of the European Union. That is a structure we're comfortable with. That is a structure that we're very comfortable with Scotland fitting into in future. Dare I say, Scotland has a far sharper sense of its place in the world than the UK does right now.
Yeah.
And this bill seeks to cement power in the hands of the unelected, aided and abetted by people who, with good intentions, I don't doubt, are facilitating that power grab, but in so doing, upending the principle of devolution that is dear to the hearts of the people of Scotland, Wales, and deeply sensitive in Northern Ireland. So when the gentleman says I'm promoting the cause of independence, damn right I am. I'm also defending constitutional probity and the rule of law within the United Kingdom. And perhaps the members opposite need to think a little bit harder about what they're being whipped through the lobbies to support. So our amendments, Sir Graham, to conclude, in good faith, we seek to insert into this package, which we dislike so much, the principle of consent of the Scottish Parliament and the devolved administrations, failing which we seek to exempt Scotland from this madness. I urge members to support the rule of law and democracy within these islands.
Can I make a bit more progress up first? I apologise. Oh, why not? I haven't had enough of you. More, please, sir.
I thank him for giving way once more. So now all this coming together, bear in mind the final decision, the CMA, or the Office Internal Market, it's going to be made up of people that we don't know yet who they are, but we know they'll be appointed by the government. Probably Dominic Cummings will have a hand in this. So what's the chances of Scottish Parliament and Scottish businesses' interests being represented by these people? There's not much coming together there, is there?
I have every faith that the Scottish people will be represented, and the Welsh and the Northern Irish, and I hate to say the word, I don't think how you mentioned this, and the English people as well.
I'm grateful for the intervention, and as an utterly pro-business but also pro-democracy party, we would contend that the Parliament of Scotland is best placed to look after jobs and work in Scotland. So would he condemn the Prime Minister's earlier comments when he used a four-letter expletive about business?
Why not? Why not? I haven't heard them yet.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, but how would he explain the fact that those of us who are not nationalists, who do not want to see independence in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, who believe wholeheartedly in the United Kingdom, feel that this section of this bill is damaging and is the very thing which will potentially tear apart the United Kingdom? How would he allow for that? How would he allow for the fact that we object to this bill?
I say sorry that you're falling into nationalistic arguments. They're giving succour to the independence movement, rather than actually coming together. If you were a true unionist should be coming together in this House.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to speak to new clause 2, tabled by my honourable friends on Labour's front bench. This
amendment seeks to put common frameworks on a statutory footing. Only yesterday, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster reassured members of the importance of common frameworks. If this is the case, I expect the government to have no problem in accepting this amendment, which seeks to prevent ministers overriding and imposing lower standards on devolved nations against their will. However, the devolved nations have every reason to be worried, because when it comes to empty words, meaningless platitudes, and empty promises, I'm afraid this government has form. There's a pattern here, Mr. Chairman. The government promises to maintain our standards while simultaneously passing laws to allow itself to lower them. Take, for example, the Environment Bill. The government used this not to set targets, but to give itself the power to set its own targets in the future. They voted against the principle of non-regression to stop environmental standards being lowered. In the Agriculture Bill, we've heard about agriculture during the course of this reading. That bill offered nothing to guarantee that food standards would not be lowered and undercut in new trade deals. So you may be wondering, why would the government keep making promises and then refuse to legislate them? The agenda's pretty clear to me. This is about creating a race to the bottom economy. It's about undermining our standards. It's about the government allowing itself to sell off our rights and protections in dangerous trade deals that will undermine our future for decades to come. Meanwhile, when we tried to amend the trade bill to at least ensure parliamentary scrutiny, the government rejected that, showing very clearly what taking back control actually means. Not parliamentary sovereignty, but an executive power grab. And now, with this bill, especially in its current form, unamended, the government is trying to cement that power grab by giving itself the right to impose lower standards on devolved nations, while ripping up the Withdrawal Agreement that it so proudly campaigned on just 9 months ago and breaking international law in the process. The government's posturing will do nothing to protect the millions of workers across the country in all 4 nations who are worried about losing their jobs. Nothing to reassure the British farmers who are worried about their products being undercut and dangerous trade deals lowering food standards. Nothing to foster the international cooperation that we need to defeat this pandemic or to tackle the climate crisis. So I urge people who have spoken passionately about our food standards, environmental standards, our trading standards, and the Union to vote for new Clause 2, so that this bill doesn't ride roughshod over our devolved nations and so that it resembles something fit for purpose.
The Office for the Internal Market will strengthen the internal market's might and efficient operation and enable real-time and considered advice to the government to help direct its route forward. We need these clauses, we need these provisions to protect and strengthen and monitor the internal market and to make safe the Union.
Paul Brisson.
Thank you, Sir Graham, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. The government is absolutely right to ensure that there are no internal barriers to trade within the UK following the end of the transition period.
To the honourable gentleman for giving way, because he's actually making some points we might be able to agree on here. Because the issue at hand is who sets the rules for the new UK internal market. So does he agree that the 4 governments should be playing an equal role in setting the rules, or does he believe it's a matter for Westminster alone? That's the fundamental issue at hand.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Now I would like to speak to my Amendment 21, my new Clause 1 and new Clause 4, which I and my Liberal Democrat colleagues have tabled. And the purpose of each of these 3 amendments is building consensus. It is something that has been sorely lacking in the whole process of implementing this bill. From the publication of the White Paper and its incredibly short consultation period back in July to the rushed programme for debate for this bill, there is clearly no willingness on the government's part to find any degree of consensus, and we've heard some of that rancour this afternoon. The devolved administrations have indicated that they are unlikely to give legislative consent to this bill. It won't, but it should be something that gives the government pause for thought. It's not just the SNP who think it does real damage to the devolved settlements, but Welsh Labour too, colleagues implied. And as a Liberal Democrat, I must say that the government is making it very hard for those of us who want to keep this United Kingdom together to make the emotional case for doing so. It seems easy to forget that just 4 years ago, the Conservative government was passing the Scotland Act 2016. That was a piece of legislation grounded in consensus, and while it was an act of the UK Parliament, the Smith Commission that preceded it was made up of Scottish political party representatives. But I am afraid that in this last year, the government has taken us far away from that model of consensus. The government has been determined to leave the customs union and the single market above all else, and this bill is a clear indication of that. I fear there has been no consideration of cost, and not simply in financial terms. This Prime Minister signed a withdrawal agreement that created a border in the Irish Sea, one voted for in January and overturned by the bill being debated in committee stage today. How many more people in constituencies such as North East Fife, constituencies that clearly voted to remain in the EU, is the government willing to alienate? And it's not just the matter of conduct, but it's also the practical realities. St Andrews University, for example, in my constituency, is the largest employer, and there are ongoing concerns not assuaged by this government's current actions around the impact of our final departure from the EU in December. So I do urge the government to change tack. Surely working in cooperation and trying to find consensus should be the way to demonstrate government good faith in the UK and its workings. And that is why I have tabled my amendments along with my parliamentary colleagues. New Clause 4 and Amendment 21 tried to take some of the spirit of what was in the Scotland Act and apply it to this bill. And I thank the Honourable Member for North East Bedfordshire, who's now back in his place, and the Honourable Member for Peterborough for their supportive comments to both my Amendment 21 and New Clause 4. And I do hope the Government will give some indication of seriously considering them. Now, one of the steps recommended in the Smith Commission put into law by the Scotland Act was Clause 65, which gave Scottish ministers the power to appoint a member to the panel of Ofcom. This piece of legislation creates new responsibilities for the Competition and Markets Authority, a body who has been well debated already this afternoon, whose public appointees are chosen by the Secretary of State for Business in the UK Government, and others have rightly pointed out that the Government has a less than transparent approach to appointments and contracts of late. Now, wouldn't it be simple to mirror what the Scotland Act did for Ofcom for the CMA? And that is the Government's intention, that the CMA has a very important role in relation to the functioning of the Union. And that's what my new Clause 4 is about. It gives the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland administrations the ability to appoint a member of the CMA board. It gives them a degree of buy-in to this body. I really hope the Government will consider supporting the amendment. There is a clear precedent for it in the Scotland Act. It gives the devolved nations a degree of ownership over the CMA and makes it more of a collective body. And my Amendment 21 tries to make sure that, as we have this raft of new responsibilities going to the CMA, it ensures there is proper buy-in and consultation with the devolved governments in relation to it. And again, this is really based on provisions that currently exist in law in the Scotland Act. It specified that for agencies like the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, for example, there should be consultation with the Scottish Government about its strategic priorities in the exercising of its functions. It's consensus, consultation, collaboration, a four-nations approach. It should be the root of all we do as a United Kingdom, and it should be, must be our starting point. Now, one of the key concerns around this bill is the fear of a race to the bottom, and the Honourable Member from Kirkcaldy Cowdenbeath referred to that earlier. One easy way that the Government could assuage these fears is by accepting likely Lord's amendments to the Trade and Agriculture bills, which has previously failed to do in this place. Now, I have tabled New Clause 1, which I believe answers and fills in one of the missing pieces of the bill, but also provides an opportunity to strengthen intergovernmental relationships. The white paper for this bill posed the question of what body to use to examine the functioning of the internal market, but it did not discuss what to do when there is actually a dispute, and nor would I argue is this answered in the bill itself. And I find it strange because there's lots in Part 4 of the bill dedicated to the CMA investigating whether or not a provision passed by a national authority has a detrimental effect on the function of the internal market, not least in Section 32. But if the CMA does indeed find that there is a detrimental effect, then other than Section 33, which states that the relevant administration should table a written statement in the respective Parliament in response to the report, Not a hint of the process to be used to reach a resolution in order to do that is detailed. Now, it may be that the UK Government is intending for dispute resolution to take place within existing governmental bodies, such as the Joint Ministerial Committee. And as part of the ongoing review taking place, that may well be the case, but it's important that that is set out. And it's also important that such a decision is made with the support of the devolved administrations. And new Clause 1 will ensure that the Secretary of State has to carry out that process of consultation and ensures that any dispute resolution mechanism provides for representation from each of the devolved nations. The Joint Ministerial Committee has been at the heart of the devolution settlement for the last 20 years. That was what the last Parliament's Scottish Affairs Committee reported into their inquiry into devolution. But it has its limitations. The committee's inquiry found that the existing set-up and organisation of the GMC has resulted in it being predominantly controlled by the UK Government, which has limited its effectiveness. In the committee's current inquiry into coronavirus, we heard that the GMC has not even met during the current pandemic. And there is also no formal mechanism for coming to agreement or resolving disputes generally. Now, as I've mentioned, there is a joint review of intergovernmental machinery ongoing, and the Minister referred to the fact that that's due to speak to report by the end of the year, but it has been ongoing since March 2018. New Clause 1 would set the UK Government and the devolved nations on a path to a dispute resolution mechanism. Fundamentally, we need a route to rebalancing the relationship between the four nations and moving to a more equitable and arguably more federal United Kingdom.
Please. Thank you, Sir Graham Brady. It's an honour to serve the Chamber under your chairmanship of this committee of the House. I must say at the outset of my comments, I do agree with the thrust of the points that were made by the member from North East Bedfordshire when he said that this bill was a move in the right direction. And I think that in Northern Ireland we can actually agree with that point. This is definitely the right step for the House to be taking. But in saying that, I think it's important, because this is about the internal markets of the United Kingdom, it's important to set the context of what that market actually means for a place like Northern Ireland. And it's vital that people understand the significance of the internal market of the United Kingdom for businesses, for people, for the employed across our beloved province. Great Britain accounts for 52.7% of Northern Ireland's external sales. So the majority of things that we sell come to the rest of Great Britain. Northern Ireland's food and drink sales, and remember, Northern Ireland food production is the single largest employer in Northern Ireland, but our food and drink sales to Great Britain are valued at over 2.3 billion of our entire local economy. Indeed, the largest market in 6 out of 10 of agri-food subsectors. That's absolutely essential that people understand. Given that the vast majority of our people are involved in food and drink production, the fact that our largest market is our home market means that this market here is vital to the understanding of how our economy works. It doesn't look south. It doesn't look to the north. It looks to our neighbour, to the biggest island in this archipelago of islands. It looks to Great Britain. And that is essential for people to understand how significant our economy is. Of course, I'll give way.
Honourable friend for giving way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Friend, agree with me that for business in Northern Ireland, free and unfettered access to GB is absolutely vital for jobs, growth and prosperity, and any obstacle to that would be critical for jobs and businesses in both your constituency and mine.
The member for Upper Bann makes a vital point, and it's shared, I think, across the House by members who recognise how vital GB is to the Northern Ireland economy, to helping it grow, to helping it flourish. And this market, if I can, Mr. Chairman, if I can put some more flesh in the bone about how vital the market is. For example, we've had an increase in freight and vehicle traffic to and from Great Britain for 9 consecutive years. So 532,000 units move out of Belfast Harbour here to GB. That's absolutely critical in understanding how our economy works. Now, I understand you'll want me to move on to our amendments and how those amendments are effective, but whenever 65% of what Northern Ireland purchases, it purchases from GB, you get an idea of how big the GB economy and how important it is, and the point that the member for Upper Bann actually made. We purchase £13.3 billion worth of purchases from GB every year. When you consider the size of the Northern Ireland economy, 1.7 million people, that we purchase almost £14 billion worth from GB. Not from Europe, not from the south of Ireland, not from the United States of America, not from any other European non-EU country, but from GB. Yeah. So this internal markets bill is vital to us. Getting this right, and the amendments within it, will make sure our country either flourishes or fails. And I believe that the members of this House want to see a flourishing union. They have different interpretations of what that union is about, and I have to respect those different interpretations. But I believe that the members from Northern Ireland plead earnestly that we make sure we get a flourishing union. And the amendments, certainly, that my party is bringing forward are about making sure that our union flourishes and that the finances within it flourish. In terms of foreign and direct investment, Mr. Brady, after London, Northern Ireland is the single largest part of the United Kingdom that benefits from foreign and direct investment. So getting a trade deal on top of this is then equally important to us, that we get those trade deals in place. But this is the foundation stone. If I could turn to some of the amendments. Each of these amendments have an impact on the economy of Northern Ireland. An impact which I hope, many of which would be for good, some would be less so. But in terms of the main clause of the bill, we want to make sure that the power to disapply or modify export declarations and other exit procedures, that is implemented and implemented fully. We can't have something which puts Northern Ireland to a disadvantage in terms of its trade and how it operates. We want to make sure that, in terms of clause 44 of the bill indicates, notification of state aid for the purposes of Northern Ireland Protocol, that Northern Ireland is treated the same as the rest of the United Kingdom. We can't have a situation where Northern Ireland's opportunity to flourish from state aid rules from GB would be changed. Let me give a very specific example. The House has been debating for some time now the issue of free ports. And indeed there's an attempt to identify where the best free ports across the whole of the United Kingdom to be. I would love some of those free ports to be in Northern Ireland, whether it's up in Londonderry at Foyle, or whether it's in Belfast Harbour on Larne, or Warren Point. I would like to see those areas identified as potential free ports. Under the current protocol, our southern neighbour, who has different economic objectives, set aside its politics, different economic objectives to Northern Ireland, it could object in the EU to Northern Ireland having a free port, and under the protocol stop Northern Ireland having a free port. Now, given that free ports appear to be the way in which the UK is looking, the UK government is looking at how it may drive the economy forward post-Brexit, Northern Ireland could be completely disadvantaged because of the predatory interests, financial predatory interests, of a country that wants to look after itself, namely the south of Ireland, at the behest of the EU. And that would be utterly disastrous. And so I hope that the Minister, whenever they're considering these issues, recognise that we welcome this because it will unfetter the attempt to tie Northern Ireland into a protocol and into a withdrawal agreement that could actually damage financial and economic opportunities that would benefit all of us. And I must say, the idea that some people will put about that this could damage the Belfast Agreement, no matter what side you're on in terms of the Belfast Agreement in 1998, at the end of the day now, we should all be on the side of wanting to make sure that Northern Ireland's economy flourishes, because it's through jobs and employment that people gain satisfaction and contentment. And if you have a contented people, you will not have a problem in terms of people being dissatisfied and community tension rising and problems flowing from that. So getting these economic aspects correct now will make sure that the peace that people cherish is actually the way of ensuring the principles that people have enunciated in this House for their love of the Belfast Agreement or Good Friday Agreement. I've absolutely no doubt about the sincerity of the people who have brought forward amendments from their part of the United Kingdom and how they want to see their part of the United Kingdom operate. But I must say that I hope that the Prime Minister is sincere in what he is bringing forward. I hope Northern Ireland is not going to be used as a pawn in this. And I say that in all sincerity. You can't afford to do that to the emotions of the people of my country. You can't kick them up and down, turn the volume up and turn the volume down, and not expect a reaction. It's far too fraught with people's concerns about their economic well-being to do that. And so I appeal to the government to, if they're doing this and they're implementing this bill, implement it with the sincerity with which we are reading through these clauses and agreeing with the clauses. Do not use us as a pawn to extract some other general concession from the EU and then desert Northern Ireland again. Now, I will say this, once bitten, twice shy. And you can fool a person once, shame on you. But if you fool a person twice, shame on me. And there will be no shame on the Ulster bench in this matter. We're warning the government, treat us with sincerity as we are entitled to. This problem protocol lies behind a lot of the amendments that have been brought before the House this evening, Sir Graham. And indeed, there have been times in the House when people have objected to the protocol because it is discrimination, or perceived as discrimination against Wales or against Scotland, that it disadvantages those regions of the United Kingdom over Northern Ireland. I would say to my colleagues in the House from those parts of the United Kingdom, the protocol actually damaged Northern Ireland, and fixing it now is the best way to actually move forward. And getting into an idea where you can now the next day support a protocol as if it's the best thing ever, whenever for the last while we've heard that there's been objections to the protocol, I think we should stop and think about that. The protocol is the problem, and it needs to be adjusted, it needs to be changed, and we need to address that. Now, the amendments do contain a running theme in them, in that they seek to obtain consent for the devolved institutions, and members have spoken at length about a perceived power grab, and I think that those are issues which the government must try to address, and address cogently, and try to reassure members on that. But I will say this, that it's very difficult for Northern Ireland members to accept those arguments about making sure that the devolved institutions are entirely in step with all of this, because the devolved institutions will never be in step with any of this. For this reason, the devolved institution in Northern Ireland cannot make an opinion on this bill because it cannot agree. It cannot find consensus. It is essentially gridlocked on this matter. And one of the amendments which hasn't been tabled, which hasn't been put forward tonight by the member for South Belfast and the member for Foyle, if that had been brought forward and had been pushed forward, we'd be actually asking this to go back to an executive that cannot agree or make an agreed statement on Brexit, on the internal markets, or on any of those matters. And I don't think we should be pushing things to a gridlock in Northern Ireland. That's where we do need this legislation to come direct from Westminster and to help us make sure that we govern with the consensus of the whole House. I was disappointed that the member for South Belfast decided not to speak in this debate earlier and removed themselves from this. I understand that the reasons why that is because the amendment was not taken, but I would have been interested to hear the points that the SDLP would make in terms of why you would want to hand a veto to a deadlocked executive or assembly on this matter. The Northern Ireland Executive and the Northern Ireland Assembly would need to focus, and they do focus, I think, individually, but collectively they must need to focus on businesses. And I hope that they will do that and ensure that that the issues that they seek to have identified, i.e. clarity on how businesses could operate under this internal markets bill, how that clarity can be applied to businesses. The one thing I hear every day from my constituents, and I'm sure it's the same for members of the SDLP, the Alliance Party, and my own party colleagues, is we want clarity on how business should be done in Northern Ireland. And businesses from all across Northern Ireland have expressed concerns about the problem protocol and its lack of clarity. And indeed, some of those points have been well made in the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee, where we have sought to get answers from the government on the clarity that is ultimately required. Indeed, I quote from the response, or from a report which we made to the government about where we need clarity. We need clarity on, are there going to be import declarations? Are there going to be entry summary declarations? Is there going to be safety and security certificates? Is there going to be export health certificates for everything? Is there going to be physiosanitary certificates? And are there going to be certificates for origin? If there are, who's going to pay for them? How are they going to be monitored? Are they going to be a computer process, a desktop process? Is it going to be for every single good? Is it going to be for 2% of the goods that currently move? Please give us clarity in all of those matters. Or do what this bill suggests and remove that paperwork. Remove that burdensome red tape. Take it away altogether and let us trade. I mean, any member in this House, let's just take England, any English member representing an English constituency, would you tolerate, if you lived in Yorkshire, having to fill in an export declaration form for goods that were moving from Yorkshire to London? You would not. Why should people in Northern Ireland and businesses in Northern Ireland have to tolerate filling in or being threatened to fill in declaration forms for that sort of movement of goods? It is not acceptable and would not be tolerated, and rightly so. And I think that the government should address that. I would also appeal to those people who have tried to be encouraged by what the US Congress has said about this bill, that if the protocol is removed, they, the US Congress and the Speaker of the House, would do their best to block trade with the United Kingdom. When you consider that the highest levels of foreign and direct investment from the United States of America come to Northern Ireland and benefit constituencies like Foyle and Belfast constituencies and my own constituency and Upper Bank constituency, who in their right mind would stand in this House and praise America and American politicians for trying to stop trade? I want to see a flourishing trade with the United States of America. We've benefited from it in the past. They've been our greatest friends. And now we have people trying to influence America for the sake of this bill to stop doing trade with this United Kingdom. It's utterly preposterous. If people were to stop and think for one moment of the consequence of that and the impact that would have on people's employment and their well-being, I think they would realise that making that crass political point serves no purpose other than to call for a blockade of trade and to damage people's well-being. The amendments that we wish to bring forward in terms of state aid rules, we want to make sure that, Mr Chairman, that Northern Ireland state aid benefits in the same way as every other part of the United Kingdom, that we don't have predatory actions from other businesses operating in the Republic of Ireland to prevent financial assistance flowing to businesses in Northern Ireland. We want to see the same flow from Her Majesty's Government that we were entitled to. Nothing more, but I'll tell you this, nothing less. We're entitled to the same. We're entitled to those benefits. And if this bill helps to repair that, and I believe our amendments tomorrow will help to do that, then I hope that we could see a significant change in the direction and climate that the agreement and the Brexit agreement has heretofore put in place. Where there has been concerns about it, some of those concerns could be alleviated. Mr Chairman, we need to address those issues. There are many other outstanding points in this bill in terms of Clause 40. There are areas that we would need to have clarity on in terms of what the special regard for the authorities and for the flow of goods between GB and Northern Ireland actually have. We need to make sure that whilst the bill appears to have reference only to the mitigating challenges facing GB to Northern Ireland trade, there is no detail on how this might work in practice in areas relating to the recognition of standards, goods and access to free trade agreements or potential divergence between EU and GB standards. We also want to make sure that devolved departments and businesses need greater clarity going forward, and can or will Her Majesty's Government disapply Northern Ireland's membership of the single market provisions for many goods. These are genuine questions that we need to have clarified, which I hope the Government does do. In terms of clauses 41 and 42, the unfettered access, which is the point that was being raised by my colleague from Upper Bank, the unfettered access issue is catered for mainly in the context of Northern Ireland to GB checks and customs. Little is contained in the bill and in the sections to the bill about GB to Northern Ireland focus. I would like to see more flesh on that point so that we see both sides of the trading equation. And indeed in clause 43 the Secretary of State will have the ability to interpret state aid protocol provision is good. We welcome that, but we want further assurances that Northern Ireland will be in the same UK framework. Those matters are important to us, Mr Chairman, to make sure that we can fully get behind this bill and see it implemented in a way that will benefit our country. Unfortunately, what appears to lie behind all of this is the question that has dogged this Parliament and the last Parliament, and that is who governs the United Kingdom. Is it Michel Barnier? Is it the European Community? Is it this Parliament? I believe it should be this Parliament and the people from all the nations of this nation coming together to govern us, and I hope that will be the outcome.
Thank you, Sir Graham. There are many things wrong with this bill, and obviously today we're focused on the creation of this yet another unelected body with the monitoring responsibilities to investigate devolved decisions. Now, we know the government, this current government, seems very keen on appointing record numbers of unelected roles. They know that they threatened to abolish the Electoral Commission, so they don't like oversight. But yet another bureaucratic body to investigate and veto what elected politicians decide in the devolved administrations, is that really what we need? Just because the Prime Minister and perhaps his government are averse to democracy and oversight doesn't mean that the rest of us are. And perhaps, if I might be so bold, is this perhaps more about the fact that the party opposite are unable to win an election in Scotland or Wales and have been unable to do so since 1957 and want to implement their own policies in disregard of the elected wishes of the Scottish people who elect democratically their Parliament at Holyrood, that's actually what this bill is all about. It's perhaps taken lessons from some of the donors in the Kremlin. This unnecessary new body will decide whether or not a bill meets its new test for the internal market, putting permanent constraints on devolved competencies of the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments and the Northern Irish Assembly. We cannot support such an anti-democratic move in principle or in practice. We seek, with the amendments lodged in the names of my honourable friend, to remove its remit from Scotland. The Office of the Internal Market should not be given the powers to monitor the regulatory provisions that apply in Scotland, but do not apply to the whole of the UK. This is nothing short of a threat to Scottish democracy. And when we look at the oversight, how are the decisions of the IOM actually going to be scrutinised? Yes, there's a report that needs to be lodged, and it will be lodged annually in this place, but there's nothing in this that tells us at what point that appears before members. Is it something like an estimates day? What is the process whereby members of this place can actually genuinely scrutinise the decisions of the IOM? We need to know that. I mean, how can we possibly give any kind of clarity to how this would work if we don't know that process of simple oversight and scrutiny? The regulations being proposed to set up this body are not only unwarranted, but they lack the necessary clarity of the extent of its remit, how the CMA will receive and consider proposals for investigations, the essential mechanisms for democratic scrutiny of the membership, dispute resolution. At the very least, it should be essential for all four administrations to agree at every stage. As the Royal Society of Edinburgh stated, the use of this authority against the wishes of the devolved administrations constitute a failure of intergovernmental relations. What happened to the respect agenda? We were told that we were in a union of equals, we were to lead, not leave. Where's that gone? Let's make this simple. The scrutiny of bills passed at Holyrood should be undertaken in Holyrood. There are transparent, proportionate processes in place, the Scottish Parliament for scrutiny bills and for the input of key stakeholders, including business, public authorities and the public. Replacing this with an unelected body, an unclear process, is a retrograde step for transparency in our own democracy. It could result in vested interests with financial clout having undue influence in regulatory challenging the decisions of our own elected representatives. We hear a lot about the unelected bureaucrats, and we did have a lesson from the honourable member from Stirling earlier, highlighting that actually some of these so-called unelected bureaucrats are indeed, in fact, elected. This is a genuinely unelected quango that we're seeing established. There is no need for the creation of a new body which could scupper much of the excellent evidence-based policy work which has served Scotland so well. Policies such as minimum pricing on alcohol, maintaining free higher education, pose no threat to the integrity of the Union, but could clearly fall foul of the rules for this new internal market.
I'm grateful to my friend for giving way and commend him on a powerful speech, but would he share my concern that, as well as the general structure of this, it is beyond ludicrous that at this late stage in the day, we still don't know who these individuals are going to be, how they're going to be appointed, who they will serve, and what policy they will actually implement.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. You could be forgiven for thinking that this bill was being rushed through without a huge amount of thought being put behind it. Not that I could ever suggest any such thing. The very premise of the internal market on which this bill is based is false. It seems to regard differences in policy decisions taken across different parts of the countries and nations as somehow a bad thing, an irritating bump in the road that somehow has to be smoothed out. That's devolution. That's the whole point and principle of devolution, that decisions can be made in a devolved administration. It was designed to respect localised democracy and better meet the differing priorities in different parts of the United Kingdom. Instead, under this bill, the centralising tendencies of this unequal union are being put into overdrive. The Scottish Government has always recognised the importance of free trade across the Isles. We have a system in place to govern trading arrangements across the UK consisting of reserved and devolved competencies. Where work is at an intersection of EU law, the four governments can and should work jointly through the common framework process. Although this involves concepts that might be difficult for the government benches to grasp: mutual trust, respect and constructive dialogue, none of which are evident in this bill. These processes are already there to ensure the continued frictionless trade across the UK that all of us want to see, and the Scottish Government happily signed up to this process. It is the correct way to proceed. This bill is a political move to curb the power of the devolved administrations, and if this government continues to seek to guarantee the controlled right of UK companies to trade unhindered in every part of the UK, they should get on with it and use the processes that are already there.
Exactly.
But do the processes within this bill mean that private health or private water companies operating in other parts of the country could soon have a guarantee to work in Scotland, where these are public companies? It's a constitutional and legislative mess. It's a blatant political move to scupper those rebellious Scots who just don't seem to fall for the charms of the Prime Minister. He's throwing his toys out of the pram and taking the huff and saying it's my ball and you can't have it. The Prime Minister has the brass neck to pretend yesterday that each devolved administration will be fully and equally involved in the monitoring the internal market, despite sovereignty resting wholly with the Westminster Government. If he's speaking in good faith, it could happen, then the government benches will be backing our amendments tonight. This would at least require the approval of devolved administrations, bringing in at least a degree of democracy and accountability to what is effectively an unelected body. This surely has to be a simple thing to support.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to speak to our Liberal Democrat amendments number 21, New Clause 1 and New Clause 4. It will come as no surprise to this House that I have serious concerns about the legislation in front of us. As a Liberal Democrat, I believe passionately in devolution. The role of our regional governments in empowering their communities is vital. If unamended, the bill effectively undermines that key function. Government must work for the whole of the United Kingdom. Food standards are a key example, and I'm sure that most, if not all, of the members of this House have been contacted by their constituency on maintaining our high food standards. It is unacceptable that the government should compromise on standards or harm British farmers by ramming through a damaging trade deal against the wishes of at least one of the nations of this United Kingdom. It is also unacceptable for all our constituents. The government must cooperate with our devolved administrations, and I urge members of this House on all sides to support our amendments, which will strengthen our devolved administrations. This is my first time to speak on this bill, and let me comment on its specific implication for Northern Ireland, an integral part of our family of nations. This bill is intended to allow frictionless trade within our four nations, and of course it would not be acceptable to have a hard internal border between any of its component parts. And on this point, I absolutely share the concerns of my colleagues on the opposite benches and indeed of the colleagues behind me. But the only reason that there is any risk of a hard internal border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK is because of the deal that the Prime Minister signed last year. It threw Northern Ireland under the bus, and I never forget the anger from the colleagues behind me. At the time, the Prime Minister called the deal a fantastic deal. So what happened to this oven-ready deal? The Prime Minister has now remembered that he has a responsibility to keep the Union together. The question is, what can he do after his deal got us into this current mess? And the government has got two options. A, it can renege on the Withdrawal Agreement, break international law, and trash our reputation as a trusted trade partner. Or it can uphold the Withdrawal Treaty, abide by international law, and negotiate a deal with the EU that avoids the need of a significant internal border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. The principle of the rule of law, a principle founded in this country, is gravely compromised by this legislation if it is passed as it stands currently. The UK has a proud history of upholding liberal democratic values and setting a global example to stand up for the rule of law. Without significant alterations, this legislation undermines our commitment to the rule of law. What does this say to the rest of the world about our values? It sends a message that we are ready to rip up agreed rules at a moment's notice for political gain. Not just to our would-be trading partners, but to authoritarian regimes around the world who are themselves determined to undermine the rule of law and promote the politics of division. Rule of law is under attack across the world, from unrest in Beirut to horrific accounts of what is happening to the Uyghur population in China. The impending economic consequences of COVID-19 are causing authoritarian regimes to grab extra power. This is the worst possible time to send that message, that in some instances, to break the law and go back on your work is acceptable. But to get a good deal with the EU is imminently achievable. It is plainly in the national interest, the very sort of deal that would avoid the need for a significant internal border. It is about regulatory alignment, closely following regulations on food and animal standards, worker and consumer rights, and competition laws. The closest working relationship with our European neighbours continues to be in all our interest. Now is not the time to undermine trust and undermine negotiations in good faith. The government must finally put the interest of the whole of the United Kingdom first, to protect the Union and to uphold international law. Please support Amendments 21, New Clause 1 and New Clause 4. Thank you.
Christine John.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here under your chairmanship. I find that we are faced with a bill, and this section in particular, which shows scant regard to several vital pillars of our democracy. And I must admit, I take great offence at the suggestion earlier that I might be a nationalist simply because I'm concerned about the impact of that argument. It's precisely because I believe in the United Kingdom that I want us to pay attention to the dangers and what this government is saying. Certainly.
I'm grateful to the lady for giving way, and I commend her on her unionism and respect it absolutely. Edinburgh West, a place I know well from my own background. But would she agree with me that there is not a single thing in the amendments brought forward by my party which are actually about independence? They are about protecting the devolution settlement. And will she be supporting our amendments as well as her?
I thank the honourable member for his comments. Yes, I support the devolution amendment, and yes, I believe and as I will come on to explain, that this is all about the devolution settlement, and that is a very different thing from independence. But the government didn't listen to us. They didn't listen to us specifically when we warned about the dangers of the Withdrawal Agreement to the Good Friday Agreement, something which I think everyone in this House should regret. So please listen to us now when we say that this approach, this bill, these steps do not respect the spirit either of that agreement or of the devolution settlement. And I disagree fundamentally with my colleagues on the benches in front of me over independence and where Scotland should be heading, but I cannot disagree with their anger at the lack of respect for ourselves, our Parliament, and for others across this United Kingdom.
Thank you, Sir Graham. It's a great honour to serve under your chairmanship and indeed to follow the speech of my honourable friend. This bill claims to be about unity based on the pillars of mutual recognition and non-discrimination. And the reality, unamended, this bill is something quite different. It's a bill that enforces the lowest common denominator in goods and services across the United Kingdom. There's such a lot of focus about the fear of letting in through the front door chlorinated chicken or whatever other emblem of lowered standards there might be through a trade deal with the US or anywhere else. This bill, unamended, is the route through the back door to lowered standards, whether it be for farmers, whether it be in retail, in manufacturing. What is the value in consistency if it leads to the lowest possible standards? How do we ensure the integrity of the Union and the dignity and indeed sovereignty of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England as we consider how to regulate these deals? Well, we have in front of us the proposal for the Office of the Internal Market, which looks to be utterly toothless in effect. At the apex of its terrifying range of powers is the ability to launch investigations and deliver written statements, and that is it. That's the entire arsenal of the devolved nations to protect their standards of goods and services. Nations who won't be around the table making the decisions in the first place. If the government thinks this is a bill about creating a united front, they are completely and utterly deluded. Rather than finding unity and a common position between the nations of the UK, these are a set of proposals, Sir Graham, which in reality drive a deeper wedge between them. And like my honourable colleagues who spoke before me, that fills me not with joy and the anticipation of another bite at the cherry independence, but complete and utter dismay. It should fill Conservative and Unionist MPs with utter dismay. I am bewildered that it doesn't. The problem is the government voted for, and the Prime Minister signed, a withdrawal agreement that he knew, he must have known, was a trade-off between a border separating Northern Ireland and the Republic or a trade border in the Irish Sea. One threatens the Good Friday Agreement and the other threatens the very existence of the United Kingdom. There was never a third option. There was no Malthouse compromise. Nothing else was on the table. It was all guff, and I pity any Tory candidate who fell for it. So, a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic or a border between Ireland and Great Britain. And the Prime Minister made a choice, and now he says he doesn't like his choice, or he didn't understand his choice, or it's all the fault of the nasty foreigners. But we have discovered in the last few days, as have millions of people who voted in good faith for this government last December, that Brexit is not done. It was never done. Either the Prime Minister didn't understand what he was signing, or he said a thing, indeed a series of things, that were not so. On this also, there is no third option. Now, more than 20 years ago, as has just been said, this country rightly moved towards devolution to empower Wales, Scotland and then Northern Ireland. To great shame, the Labour government at that time did not do so further in empowering the regions of England also. But of course, the devolution that did happen at the time was opposed by the Conservative Party in opposition. But in time, they grew to accept the new devolved nature of government in these islands, because guess what? Proportional representation gives you seats in Scotland. But if on issues where those devolved administrations have competence, this government forces them to submit to whatever standards it decides upon in the guise of unity, then all we are doing is enforcing the lowest common denominator. We will not be levelling up, we will be forcibly levelling down. The government will be sticking up two fingers at devolution. This is then a significant threat to the Union. I am waiting and waiting for the moment when members of the Conservative and Unionist Party will grasp the second part of their name and their mission. The current Conservative leadership deemed this bill to be just another convenient trench in the culture war. I implore Conservative MPs to take back control of their party before it is too late and we lose our country. And then there will be no union for us to be unionist about. In South Cumbria, I am 50 miles from the Scottish border. I have no desire to live 50 miles from a foreign border. Not in my lifetime, not in my children's or grandchildren's lifetimes. There are both practical and emotional reasons that this bill is the worst thing to come to this House in the 15 years I have been a Member of Parliament. Cumbria does not have a more important internal market than our relationship with South West Scotland. It is a porous border, not even recognised by many. People work on one side of the border, live on the other, go to school on one side and visit their GP on the other side. Sheep reared in Cumbria, sold in Scotland. Cattle reared in Scotland, sold in Cumbria. Farmers dependent upon common standards on both sides, about to see those standards undermined. Our farmers to be sold down the river across all nations. Every poor decision, every compromise will sow more seed of discontent in the devolved nations, playing into the hands of those who are desperate to split us asunder. To many, this might feel academic, maybe to the genius spin doctors in Whitehall who play with our country as though it's some kind of great board game, some game of risk. Academic for them, funny for them, a game for them. It's not for us in Cumbria, not for our farmers, not for our tourism sector. In fact, for most of us, it matters massively. It is emotional and it is practical, and you are playing games with the future of our relationship with our most important trading partners. The government seems not to care one bit about the cross-border single market of Cumbria and Dumfriesshire, for example. We need all the nations around the table and robust regulation of market and trading decisions so that my farmers in Cumbria are not undercut by government regulations and then really until they are none the wiser and it's too late. We have the best standards of animal welfare, environmental control, food safety in the world. I do not want there to be an inbuilt race to the bottom within the nations of the United Kingdom that undermines that correct reputation. I will happily give way.
If I may just pick up on what John has said, but many speakers on the other side have said this. They've talked about race to the bottom on regulations, right? Please indicate where you see any of that deregulatory zeal in this government. I would like to see some deregulatory zeal. The truth of the matter is that historically and certainly in recent years, the pattern of regulation of markets, whether it is in Scotland or in the rest of the United Kingdom, is for more and higher regulation. That's the story. The impact of the government is they want to say and continue to maintain high standards. Where would he point to so I could see all of these things that he's waving around as something that we should be fearful of?
I'm grateful for his intervention. We should be aware that on top of the desire politically for greater regulated markets, which I absolutely welcome, that there is also a desire to maximise profit. So what do you do when you're trying to maximise profit? You reduce costs. What are regulations? Well, sadly, they often involve more costs. That's one of the benefits of the European Union, is that we lock ourselves in we lock ourselves in to understanding that there is common rules. There are common rules. If within the United Kingdom we create an inbuilt incentive for one part of the United Kingdom to reduce its standards and therefore automatically drag down the standards of the other three parts of the UK at the same time, you have made this possible, and indeed I would argue, thanks to the laws of free market economics, you have made it more than likely, you've made it almost certain. The Competition and Markets Authority should be representative of all the nation. There needs to be unity in the decisions and not just in the implementation of the conclusions. I am afraid for the future of our United Kingdom. Does this government want to be the administration responsible for the disintegration of our union, whether by negligence or design? And that is where it is taking us. This bill, through its inherent relegation of the importance of devolution, is a colossal step towards a witless step even to undermining the unity of the union. This government has taken us out of one union. We will not let them wreck another, which is all the more precious even than the one that we have left.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I rise to speak to the amendments in my name and the names of my honourable and right honourable friends. We've had some good contributions by colleagues across the House today. And today we're discussing the Internal Market Bill in committee stage, or as I think the Prime Minister now calls it after his roasting yesterday, the Infernal Markets Bill. Let's hope that when the Minister rises he's better briefed, but I've no doubt he will be, because unlike his boss, he very much is a details man. Before I move to the substance of the amendments before us, I want the House to be clear on a few points. Labour wants the government to get Brexit done, and we want a strong internal market that respects devolution and protects high regulatory standards. But we will not fall for the attempt by the Prime Minister to rerun the Brexit arguments, and neither should the public. The Brexit issue is settled, and for the government, they now need to get on and get the deal they promised the British people at the last election. The Prime Minister's attempts to boost his falling poll ratings have failed. Brexiteer after Brexiteer has denounced this bill. They clearly didn't get the memo that opposing this bill was some kind of Remainer plot. It is not. We've had a roll call of the great and the good, some not so good, but I'll let you decide which. Lords Howard, Lords Lamont, the Right Honourable Member for Torridge and West Devon, and the Honourable Member for Gillingham and Raynham, to name but a few. They have spoken out with courage because this bill, in its current form, is not in the national interest. So to the amendments, Mr Chairman. The central challenge facing those drafting this bill was how to square an internal market where goods could be sold across the UK with the fact that regulatory standards in key areas like animal welfare, the environment, food safety and many others are devolved. There was an obvious answer, because since 2017 there has been a process of agreeing common frameworks, a joint approach to standards in the different devolved areas. The government could have chosen to legislate for those common frameworks to make them the default option for regulation, thereby granting a proper voice to the devolved nations in the regulatory standards to which we have to adhere to. To be clear, this would have imposed a duty on all governments to seek to establish common high standards. There would have also needed to have been an ultimate last resort if that way forward could not have been agreed to, and then the UK Parliament would need to step in. This would have been the way to square the circle of the internal market and respecting devolution. But unfortunately, this is not the route that the government has chosen. They have chosen instead non-binding common frameworks up against what is essentially a Westminster veto, potentially leading to lower standards with no guarantee of a voice for the devolved nations. The government say that they will still negotiate for common frameworks. This is welcome, but it is not enough. If you do not put the process for common frameworks on a statutory footing, you undermine the very process itself, making the nuclear option of imposition more and more likely. So common frameworks without some legislation are toothless. As time becomes more and more pressing for regulations to be implemented, and with the looming prospect of other trade deals and their inevitable call on UK-wide standards, you can see how this plays out, with the imposition of regulations via statutory instruments becoming the norm. In line with getting Brexit done, there is now a huge repatriation of powers from the EU to the UK. The government has a choice to make. Does it want to respect and strengthen the devolution settlement by pushing powers closer to people in communities as promised in the referendum, or do they want to retain all those powers here in Westminster? At best, this bill is a missed opportunity to strengthen our union, and at worst, it threatens the future of the UK itself. As we've heard today, giving the First Minister and the SNP all the grievances they need to turbocharge their independence campaign. One only has to listen to the voices across our four nations to realise this, yet the Prime Minister and the government has a tin ear. A Conservative Welsh frontbench member resigned because of the bill's disregard and disrespect towards the nations of the UK. It's worth listening to what he had to say, and I quote, "The internal market bill has done nothing to lessen my anxieties about the danger facing our 313-year-old union. Indeed, they have been gravely aggravated by the decisions made in the last few days by the Prime Minister. I felt it necessary to speak out against what I consider to be a lack of stagecraft at this crucial time for the UK's very survival as a multi-state union." I certainly will.
She's absolutely right to draw attention to those comments. Well, I'm a very honourable man, one of my own constituents, David Melding, the Shadow Counsel General, lifelong Conservative, loyal Conservative, disagree with on many issues. But he was pointing out this is a pattern of behaviour here from this government of disrespect for devolution. I've just been speaking to the First Minister of Wales, and he's been very, very clear this is a pattern of behaviour that we're seeing on everything from COVID testing to the situation regarding this bill. So does she not agree with me that the government need to take a completely different approach if they want the UK internal market to work as we do?
I absolutely do, and my friend, my honourable friend, has made some powerful points here today about the disrespectful way in which the Welsh Government were consulted over this bill, and he's absolutely right to highlight those. And I'm afraid, if that continues, then that won't be good at all. Labour firmly believes that the UK single market is the foundation stone of our union. That's why we support the principle behind the government's bill and why our amendments are so necessary to improve the bill through its committee stage. We know that we need mutual recognition for our internal market to function coherently, and we believe that we should be using this opportunity now to drive standards up further. Our amendments today are about the way in which that we arrive at those minimum standards, not whether or not minimum standards are required. The Common Frameworks programme has been in place since 2017 and has led to some extremely positive outcomes, even in policy areas as complex and as contentious as food standards. I was very grateful to the Minister for the Cabinet Office for speaking with me last night about how the Common Frameworks programme is progressing. The government and the devolved governments should be commended for having established this collaborative forum. But it could have proceeded perhaps with a little bit more speed and zeal, but we recognise the competing demands on the government. But the government's bill as it stands has the potential to undermine these processes entirely. Taking food standards, where a common framework has already been agreed, as an example, if the Prime Minister were to pursue a free trade deal with the US, we may see chlorinated chicken imported into the UK, making its way onto Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish supermarket shelves, irrespective of the standards they've worked so hard to agree through the common framework today. But it isn't just food. This bill could have far-reaching implications for the country's ability to reduce waste and meet our net zero targets too. New Clause 2 sets out a process which will underpin the Common Frameworks approach in good faith and within reasonable time commitments. This puts the Common Frameworks programme on a clear statutory footing. We propose that where there are already common frameworks in place, ministers should not be able to unilaterally override them via secondary legislation and impose lower standards on devolved administrations without their consent, as this bill would currently allow. And where any frameworks are currently in development, or as any new common frameworks become necessary, ministers would need to allow a consensus-based negotiation via the framework process to take place within a reasonable timeframe before making any further intervention via Westminster. Only if an agreement could not be reached through this process would a minister be able to intervene and protect the internal market. Of course, we do accept the... Yes, I will give way briefly.
I'm extremely grateful to her for giving way, and I agree with the vast majority of new clause 2, but this is the one point that really worries me, because it does indicate that Westminster will have supremacy over Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Am I right in interpreting the end of the new clause in that manner? And surely her colleagues in Wales will be very concerned about any proposal which means that the Westminster Parliament will have supremacy over the Welsh Parliament.
Well, this might be where we differ, as I was going to come on to say, because ultimately we do believe that the ultimate arbiter of the UK internal market would need to be the UK turning to Parliament Clause 3. Labour supports the need for some kind of independent body to arbitrate the effectiveness of the internal market. However, we do want to make sure that this body is fully accountable to the views of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and crucially has proper teeth to be able to do what it needs to do. New Clause 3 therefore places a legal obligation on the CMA to monitor, report and most importantly to consult with the devolved administrations when discharging their new and enhanced Turning to some of the amendments in the name of the Scottish Nationalist Party. While I agree with much of the speech from the member proposing the amendments earlier, it does appear from these amendments that the Scottish Nationalist Party do not want a functioning internal market. They want to frustrate one. And I'm afraid that some of their amendments would, in essence, give a veto to the Scottish Parliament of the internal UK single market. And that's not something that we can support, because we believe that the UK Parliament has to be the final arbiter of a functioning internal market, because we believe in the UK.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to thank all the honourable and right honourable members who have spoken here to ensure that UK companies can trade unhindered in every part of the UK, and their focus on the core issues to ensure that free trade must be commended. Turning now to the independent body that we're discussing today, created by the provisions in Part 4. We consulted on how to ensure an independent monitoring and advice function could uphold the internal market. In response and to oversee the functioning of the internal market, this bill sets up an office for the internal market within the Competition and Markets Authority. It minimises the need to seek court. The new office for the internal market will be able to provide non-binding expert reporting and technical monitoring and regulations and proposals, which will provide robust evidence on the actual or potential impact of regulatory measures. Let's turn now to the amendments discussed by honourable members today, starting with Amendment 28, Clause 28. Clause 28 is important as it defines those regulatory provisions on which the CMA it will report and advise. This will ensure certainty and transparency for administrations, businesses and the general public. Regulatory provisions are within scope if they set requirements for the purposes of the mutual recognition and non-discrimination principles of this bill for the sale of goods and the equivalent for services, as well as recognition of professional qualifications, and if it applies to one or more nations, but not the whole of the United Kingdom. So as we've heard, Amendment 28 seeks to exclude Scotland from the benefits of the new Office of the Internal Market. This amendment would carve out regulation that applies only in Scotland from the definition of regulatory provisions across this part.
Please help me. I'm very grateful to him for giving way. But if the Office for the Internal Market writes a report which says that, for instance, a regulation passed by the Northern Ireland Assembly, if it was functioning, is contrary to the principles of the Internal Market Bill? Are they then open to possible legal recourse against a company that's affected because of the policy implemented by Northern Ireland Assembly?
But ultimately, yeah, the courts are there as a last resort. I want to turn now to the specifics of Amendment 29, which seeks to constrain the Office for Internal Market operating within the Competition and Markets Authority from taking forward any independent review without the prior approval of the legislatures in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We can't support this amendment. Clause 32 sets out the reporting procedure that the CMA will undertake for regulations that are already enacted within any part of the United Kingdom and are considered to have actual or anticipated detrimental impacts on the UK internal market. Clause 33 sets out the process the CMA, the UK government and devolved administrations must follow once a report under Clause 32 has been produced by the CMA and laid before the legislators. It requires the Minister and the administration responsible for implementing the regulatory provision that was the subject of the CMA's report. The purpose of Clause 34 is to allow the CMA to exclude some categories of information from its published reports, and it can exclude that information if it believes it's contrary to the public information to disclose the interest to disclose the information, if it contains commercial information that might significantly harm the business interests of another person, it contains information about an individual's private affairs, the disclosure of which might significantly harm the individual's interest. That discretion is obviously necessary in specific circumstances to provide assurances for businesses and individuals' interests. Clause 35 sets out that the CMA must publish general advice and information about how it expects to approach the exercise of its monitoring, advisory and reporting functions, which is under the clauses 29 to 32, and that's necessary to ensure that the way it approaches its functions is visible and clear to the public. But Amendment 21, which seeks to include a duty on the CMA to consult the devolved administrations prior to publishing guidance on the exercise of its internal market functions, it's not necessary or helpful to put a duty to consult in statute.
The Minister for giving way, and he's doing his best job to front this up and to actually give some of the detail the Prime Minister wasn't across yesterday. Does he not have the slightest bit of doubt when his own colleague, the legal expert, the legal representative on the Welsh Conservative benches in the Senedd, David Melding, resigned, saying that this bill posed dangers to the Union and that those have been gravely aggravated by the decisions of the Prime Minister? When somebody of that standing has criticised the bill in this way, does he not have any qualms about what he's doing?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for that, which is specifically why I'm going through the clauses and the amendments at committee stage to keep the focus on what is so important, what businesses expect us to actually do. Amendment 30 requires the Secretary of State to obtain the agreement of the devolved administrations before the Secretary of State specifies the level of financial penalties in secretary legislation in cases of non-compliance with the information gathering notice from the CMA. It wouldn't therefore be appropriate to create a legislative underpinning for UK common frameworks. I hope that the amendments will be withdrawn and then we can get on with getting this bill through the House. Thank you.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr Evans. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I must admit I'm still reeling somewhat from the irony of the government opposing Amendment 29 on the basis of political intrusion. We've heard today from those who support independence and from those who are die-hard unionists in this chamber today. We've heard from the concerns of the Welsh Government. And can I say it is not a manufactured grievance to have these concerns from the Welsh Government, because they're genuine concerns. But that also is true for Scotland too. These are not manufactured problems, these are real world problems. And I've got to say that the Labour front bench speech was warmly welcomed by those benches opposite today. The party that brought devolution in, the party of John Smith, undermining devolution in the way they did during that speech, deserves some proper reflection. In this debate today, we've heard some warm words, but again, we've had absolutely no detail of how this is going to actually be protecting devolution. It's not. We've had no detail of the Office of the Internal Market. Who is going to be in that unelected body? How can we vouch for the integrity of anybody when we don't know that who's going to be on that body, who's going to elect them to, who's going to appoint them, I should say, to them? This The Minister talked about alcohol minimum pricing, which by definition is a discriminatory policy in Scotland. How can that possibly be protected under these measures today? It cannot be. And if we choose in Scotland, if the Scottish people vote for policies that are going to be aimed at public health that cause that problem, then this bill still undermines the ability to do that. So they're determined to continue with their programme of overriding the Scottish Parliament, its elected representatives, and this underlines the fact that Scotland will never be seen as an equal member of the UK. We do not accept this. The people in Scotland are seeing, and it's reported in poll after poll, that the only way to protect our Parliament is to be an independent nation. Mr Evans, I move our amendment.
So Amendment 28 not being withdrawn, I will now put the question. The question is then Amendment 28 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 51. The noes to the left, 351.
The ayes to the right, 51. The noes to the left, 351. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. The question is that Clause 28 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. With leave of the House, I will put the questions on Clauses 29 to 39 stand part together. The question is that Clause 29 to 39 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I've selected new clause 2 for separate decision, and I call Lucy Powell to move new clause 2 formally.
Move formally.
The question is that new clause 2 be read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby.
Order.
The ayes to the right, 195. The noes to the left, 356.
The ayes to the right, 195. The noes to the left, 356. The noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. In normal circumstances, I would now leave the clerk's chair and come back to the chair. So we will have the mace replaced. The House has now resumed as the House, not as a committee. Order.